pre-workout supplementation research. In fact, with some minor edits and updates, there were really only 2 studies that I was able to add into this presentation to give it additional substance. So we'll talk about some future directions at the end. So pre-workouts, as you probably know, are designed to be taken before training sessions or competitions. And these supplements are generally contain some sort of caloric energy, sometimes ergogenic aids and central nervous system stimulants, usually within a proprietary blend. There have been many, many studies that have examined the effects of some of these individual compounds by themselves, as well as multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements. Now, this is a poor title because if you've ever taken a pre-workout supplement, the question isn't if you're hyped up, because you are hyped up. But the question is, there we go. Does this state of super arousal confer some sort of ergogenic benefit? So today we'll look at the history of pre-workout supplements through the ages. Really briefly, I could spend all day on that because I find it fascinating. We'll highlight potential mechanisms behind popular individual ingredients. We'll discuss the ergogenic efficacy of some of these popular ingredients. We'll identify and very briefly discuss some novel emerging ingredients. And we'll look at synergistic effects, and I'll give you some directions for the future. To start this presentation, we need to go all the way back to about 500 BC, where modern sport, as best we know it, first emerged in the Olympics of ancient Greece. And so winning brought about not only honor, but also a very hefty purse, as it does today. At this time, Hippocrates argued for observation over superstition, and doctors played an important role in formulating, administering, and monitoring the effects of ergogenics on their athletes' successes. So not all that different from modern times. You might contend that this was the birth of sports supplement research. During this time, the ergogenic aid of choice, the pre-workout of choice, was sheep testicles. The best athletes, including the famed Milo of Crete, the carrier of the man that could put a grown bull on his shoulders, consumed testicles pre-competition. So you know it must work if he did it. Roman gladiators also used to consume a form of pre-workout prior to their events. Of this, these ingredients were supposed to mask pain, and within it was strychnose, a plant that contains strychnine. Strychnine is similar in structure to caffeine. In small amounts, it was stimulatory. In large amounts, you now find it in rat poisoning. We'll come back to this ingredient in a few slides. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the Zulus were drinking an elixir of grape skins and kola nuts prior to battle. And the Dutch described the Zulu warriors as some of the fiercest they had ever encountered. And the Zulus called this elixir dup, and this is how the term doping in sports was born. The magic in the kola nuts was caffeine. This brings us to the turn of the 20th century, where a marked rapid rise in the public interest in sports occurred. I should note that in 300 AD, the church outlawed Olympics, and so there wasn't very much happening in Europe up until about the 1800s. During this time, the most popular pre-workout supplements were cocaine and, once again, strychnine. So we've come quite a way since the turn of the 20th century. So let's fast forward to today, and these are some of the best-selling pre-workout supplements on the market, at least as far as I know. There are a lot of pre-workout supplements now on the market. Unfortunately, there hasn't been very much research on particular formulations, and it would be impossible to discuss all these different formulations individually. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify common ingredients in these popular brands and talk about some of the research underlying the use of some of these popular ingredients. Now, given that pre-workout supplements are marketed mostly to enhance resistance exercise performance, we're going to talk about this in the context of resistance exercise and of resistance training. So you may hear me discuss ingredients or supplements that have proven efficacy and but say they don't have efficacy in resistance exercise. And that's because that efficacy is in some other form of exercise. So the most common ingredients that we find in pre-workouts are stimulants first, caffeine particularly, nutrients or ingredients that are providing some sort of perhaps caloric energy, such as branched chain amino acids and taurine, and then what we can classify as non-nutritive, arginine, creatine, beta-alanine, betaine, and citrulline malate. The most popular ingredient that kind of makes the base of nearly every pre-workout supplement is caffeine. And caffeine is lipid soluble. It easily crosses the blood to brain barrier where it can interact with the central nervous system. In doing so, it can bind to adenosine receptors and block adenosine receptors and their effect on inducing central sensations of fatigue. Caffeine also increases dopamine signaling, which appears to increase activity, at least acutely, in mice. Caffeine also appears to enhance the release of beta endorphins during prolonged exercise, and this may lead to reduced sensations of RPE. And finally, caffeine increases epinephrine and norepinephrine concentrations in a dose-dependent manner. And this may help to attenuate glycogen depletion. In regards to resistance training, it appears that caffeine also facilitates the release of calcium by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, thus potentiating twitch potentiation or force production. So we have a number of underlying mechanisms whereby caffeine may be ergogenic. And we also have a number of studies that shows that caffeine is indeed ergogenic. Caffeine enhances cognitive ability and learning, and it can enhance some of the psychological aspects of training. The effects of caffeine on resistance exercise performance are a little less clear. Most of the research seems to suggest that caffeine is most useful in resistance exercise programs that have a higher volume, use more moderate loads, so 60 to maybe like 85% of the 1 RM for multiple sets, and employ large muscle groups. And it also seems that caffeine has a greater impact on trained subjects compared to untrained subjects. So 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram appears to be the optimal dose for improving resistance training performance. Most pre-workout supplements provide that, if not more caffeine. So we can give a thumbs up to caffeine as an ergogenic aid within pre-workout supplements. The next most common ingredient that I encountered was branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Leucine is suggested to increase muscle protein accretion by directly enhancing the mammalian target of rapamycin. And prolonged intense exercise increases branched chain amino acid oxidation. And a decline in these BCAAs in the serum is associated with a rise in tryptophan in the CNS and serotonin production, which causes fatigue. And so it's thought that supplemental BCAAs attenuate this and thus enhance performance through the central fatigue mechanism. Now, BCAAs have been found to enhance prolonged endurance performance, and these are in doses of about 10 grams, and it's likely due to a attenuation of glycogen depletion. However, during nearly most common resistance exercise sessions that are 1 to 2 hours in length, comprised of maybe 10 to 20 sets, glycogen depletion and rises in central tryptophan are hardly a concern, especially in the fed state. So the effects of BCAA supplementation on resistance training performance is equivocal. There's not a lot of research to suggest that it is ergogenic, and while it may improve markers of muscle damage, most of these studies have not measured performance the next day. And so for BCAAs and their efficacy in pre-workout supplements, we can give them a thumbs down. Another very popular ingredient in pre-workout supplements is arginine and some of the metabolites of arginine. Arginine is a conditionally essential amino acid, and it's used in protein synthesis, ammonia detoxification, and may also be converted to glucose for energy. But the major theory behind arginine in pre-workout supplements and as the ergogenic aid is to increase nitric oxide synthesis. By increasing nitric oxide synthesis, we may see an increase in force production at the muscle fiber level. Nitric oxide may also enhance muscle shortening velocity and tension. And nitric oxide may also enhance performance through the delivery of oxygen and glucose, as well as waste product removal via its vasodilation effects. So in this first image here, what we see is plasma arginine concentrations. And arginine is highly degraded in the gut when consumed. And so the open circles represent oral consumption and plasma concentrations following that consumption. The closed circles represent venous infusion. And if you notice the vertical scale, we can see that the effects of venous infusion are 10 times those of oral consumption. When it comes to actually increasing nitric oxide in the blood, arginine is not very effective. In the open squares and triangles is the effect of oral arginine consumption on nitric oxide levels. And you can see that it's just a very, very small effect compared to venous infusion. So oral arginine has a minimal effect on nitric oxide and has not been found to improve resistance training performance. So arginine and its metabolites, and for that matter, just about any nitric oxide boosting supplement in pre-workouts doesn't seem to confer any ergogenic benefit in the context of resistance exercise performance. This brings us to creatine monohydrate. Creatine is one of the most studied supplements ever, maybe with the exception of caffeine. And in addition to increasing phosphocreatine levels for faster ATP regeneration, creatine also causes an uptake of water within the muscles. And this causes a cellular swelling effect that may result in improved excitation, contraction, coupling, or a more hospitable environment for protein synthesis. The doses in most pre-workout supplements are usually about 2 to 3 grams per day, and this does not seem to be enough to increase intramuscular phosphocreatine. It appears that at the minimum, doses of 3 to 5 grams per day are necessary, but a period of at least 5 days of continuous intake is necessary to increase phosphocreatine concentrations within skeletal muscle. So we know that creatine is effective, at least if you are a member of the ISSN or have been reading any of the position statements. Creatine is effective at increasing lean mass. It enhances improvements in strength and power output. And in trained men, we see these increases over the course of 8 weeks, an average of maybe 9.6 kilogram greater improvements in squat strength compared to placebo. And these effects are exerted over the course of 8 to 10 weeks, after which time the results are maintained over placebo. The effects of creatine timing, pre versus post, are equivocal. One study did show greater increases in lean mass when creatine was consumed post-workout compared to pre-workout. For creatine to have an effect, though, it must be given time to accumulate in the tissues. So it needs to be taken rather consistently over a prolonged period of time. And for that reason, creatine in pre-workout supplements may be effective if you are taking that pre-workout supplement every single day. However, most individuals that take pre-workouts only a few times a week to enhance performance are probably not receiving any benefit from the creatine in that pre-workout product. Beta-alanine is a non-proteogenic amino acid, so it isn't incorporated into skeletal muscle proteins. It is, however, the rate-limiting substrate for carnosine synthesis, which is the main intracellular hydrogen buffer. And it's proposed that increases in intracellular hydrogen disrupt energy production and excitation, contraction, and coupling, thereby reducing force output and potentially resulting in fatigue. And so by increasing intramuscular carnosine, we can buffer more acids, thereby potentially improving performance. Now, the dose of beta-alanine in most pre-workout supplements is about 1 to 2.5 grams, enough to give you that sensation of paresthesia, the tingling sensation. However, for beta-alanine to exert an effect, it needs to be taken consistently. So at least 4 weeks of loading, at least 4 grams per day must be consumed to increase intramuscular carnosine levels. So does beta-alanine work? It is quite effective in enhancing performance in bouts lasting 60 to 240 seconds. But beta-alanine does not seem to have a significant impact on absolute strength. And resistance training, session quality, and its effects on repetitions to fatigue are quite equivocal. Our group found that 5 grams of beta-alanine supplementation did not improve repetitions to fatigue in the leg press. It didn't improve maximal strength, nor did it enhance body composition. So no improvements in lean mass. So beta-alanine is probably useful for training that is longer or intermittent training that's longer in duration, but its effects on resistance training are quite equivocal. And the more studies that come out, the less convincing it is that beta-alanine will confer any significant benefit to resistance training performance. And then as far as beta-alanine in pre-workout supplements goes, there's typically not enough of a dose in there to increase muscle carnosine concentrations. And just like creatine, it needs to be taken consistently to have any sort of effect. So beta-alanine in pre-workout supplements, probably not very useful. Trimethylglycine, or betaine, is another ingredient that is becoming more common in pre-workout supplements. Betaine is an organic osmolyte, and it induces cellular swelling and may promote protein synthesis in that regard. And it's also involved in the synthesis of creatine, carnitine, and phosphatidylcholine. However, if you are to compare the ergogenic effects of betaine versus creatine, there's really no comparison. Creatine, time and time again, promotes ergogenic effects in measures of resistance exercise performance, while the effects of betaine on resistance exercise performance are equivocal, with more studies showing no impact on absolute strength, and a few studies, but more studies than not, showing no improvement in repetitions to fatigue. And just like beta-alanine and creatine, betaine needs to be taken for at least 2 weeks, it appears, to have any sort of impact on muscular performance. So the application of betaine in pre-workout supplements also doesn't seem very effective. Generally, the doses are too low. And again, it's a supplement that needs to be taken chronically to see an effect. It doesn't confer any sort of acute ergogenic benefit. This brings us to taurine, which is named after a Latin derivative of the word ox or bull, and it was first found in ox bile. Taurine is also rich in organ meats. Because taurine crosses the blood-to-brain barrier, it's been suggested that it may improve mental focus and concentration, especially during exercise. Now, there's some evidence that taurine supplementation may reduce muscle damage and delayed onset muscle soreness, and also plays a role in glucose homeostasis. So these are the underlying mechanisms by which taurine may confer some sort of ergogenic benefit in resistance exercise. There's been studies that have investigated taurine on cognition and memory, and there's only a few that are in humans. These studies have generally combined taurine with caffeine, and when taurine is combined with caffeine, it does seem to have an impact on cognition, but they've always been compared to a placebo. So we don't know if there's any sort of synergistic effect of taurine and caffeine, or if it's just the caffeine alone. Taurine does seem to enhance, there's been some studies that showed it's enhanced performance during cycling, but whether this translates to resistance exercise or not is unknown. One study did look at resistance training performance, and it used only eccentric exercise in untrained subjects. In this study, it decreased muscle damage and delayed onset muscle soreness. However, it was combined with branched chain amino acids. And so whether taurine alone has much of an impact on resistance exercise isn't known. It requires a little more research. So our verdict on taurine is another thumbs down. It's not going to hurt you, but it's probably not going to improve your resistance exercise session quality. This brings us to citrulline malate, which often gives pre-workout supplements a very acidic taste. The typical dose in pre-workout supplements is approximately 4 to 6 grams, and the only reported side effect of citrulline malate appears to be some stomach discomfort. Now, citrulline is an arginine precursor, and by consuming citrulline, it will result in an increase in nitric oxide synthesis. However, this increase in nitric oxide synthesis doesn't seem to improve resistance exercise performance. Malate facilitates ammonia and urea clearance and increases renal bicarbonate reabsorption. And through an increase in renal bicarbonate reabsorption, we may see an increase in hydrogen buffering, and that may enhance performance during resistance exercise. So acute doses of 8 grams 1 hour prior to resistance training may be effective at improving resistance training performance. There's been a couple studies that have shown this, but a couple studies that also have not. Now, for this citrulline malate to be effective, it would appear that the resistance training session should be high in volume with moderate to short rest periods, employing large muscle groups and a high number of sets. So what we're looking at is what might be described as a typical bodybuilding type workout with moderate loads, higher reps, training for a pump, that kind of thing. When volume is low, when we're looking at explosive type of movements or changes in 1 RM, citrulline malate doesn't appear to have much of an effect. And lower doses have not been studied. So in some pre-workout supplements, the doses may be sufficient. In others, it may not be enough to confer any sort of ergogenic benefit. Well, we'll give citrulline and malate a thumbs up for the time being. This concludes the most common ingredients that are found that have some sort of research related to resistance exercise performance on them. But there's also, if you've ever looked at the label of common pre-workout supplements, there are a number of other ingredients that are generally included in there. Some of these ingredients are nootropics, such as huperzine. Some of them are suggested to increase nitric oxide, such as agmatine. There's not a lot of research on their effects alone. The ones related to nitric oxide, like hordenine and agmatine, we can probably rule out because nitric oxide boosting supplements appear to be relatively ineffective at increasing resistance exercise performance. The supplements in the low evidence category, D-aspartic acid, DMAA, which is now banned, I believe, choline, tyrosine, B vitamins, etc., don't really have any good evidence to support their use as an ergogenic aid, which kind of begs the question of why are they included in most pre-workout formulations. And then we have the emerging supplements or the emerging ingredients. And these have some positive research behind their claims, but very little related to exercise performance. For example, theacrine has 2 studies related to exercise. One of those studies was conducted by Dr. Tim Ziegenfuss and colleagues. And in that study, that showed an improvement in motivation and willingness to exercise, but exercise itself was not actually studied. The other study was an unpublished thesis out of Southern Indiana University, I believe, and they looked at the effects of acute theacrine supplementation on 1 RM in the leg press and bench press, as well as repetitions to fatigue in the leg press and bench press, and found no benefits. Alpha GPC has shown some benefits in resistance training context, while other studies have shown no results or no significant improvements. But the studies that have shown benefits, the effect sizes have been really small, and whether they are practically meaningful or not is yet to be known. Rhodiola is an herb that's purported to improve endurance and cognitive energy. I first heard of rhodiola in the late 90s. There's been a few studies in endurance exercise that show a benefit, but resistance training studies don't seem to exist to my knowledge. And the effects of rhodiola on exercise, those studies seem to stop around 2014, 2015. So for rhodiola to exert any sort of effect, it probably will have to be in a marathon-esque type resistance training session. So something that is very long in duration and very high in volume and likely lower in load intensity to actually have some sort of benefit. What we really want to know, though, is do pre-workout supplements, is there a synergistic effect? So do these ingredients, do they act together to improve performance above taking these ingredients alone? So does 1 + 1 = 3? There's been a number of studies that have shown that pre-workout supplements are relatively safe. Most of the commercially available pre-workout supplements, the major side effects are an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, but that's transient. There's been several studies that have been conducted that showed pre-workout supplements improve strength performance. The effects of chronic use are equivocal. Some show an improvement in adaptation and lean mass, others do not. All of these pre-workout supplements, except for 2 studies though, have been compared against a placebo. So I want to go through those 2 studies. The first study we conducted at Coastal in 2018, and we compared a pre-workout supplement versus an equal dose of caffeine versus a placebo. The dose of caffeine was 250 milligrams. Now, the downside to this study was that we only had 10 subjects. Hurricane Florence closed down the school for 3 weeks and ruined our product. So we really can't conclude much. There was no difference in total reps, but we did see an improvement in squat quality repetitions, which we defined as repetitions that were performed at or above 90% peak power output during a set of squats to failure. Since that time, the supplement company that funded the project went under new ownership and eventually closed its doors, and no other company would fund the project, so we moved on. The second study, conducted by Lutch, Andrew Yagam, and colleagues in 2020, looked at the effects of a multi-ingredient pre-workout supplement versus caffeine on energy expenditure and feelings of fatigue during a low-intensity treadmill exercise test in college-aged men. So we're not looking at exercise performance, but we're looking at energy expenditure. The dose of caffeine was 6 milligrams per kilogram in both the pre-workout supplement as well as the caffeine individually, and a placebo was used. And what they found was that the pre-workout and caffeine both increased energy expenditure, carbohydrate, and fat oxidation, but there were no differences in between. And there were also no differences between caffeine and caffeine and pre-workout supplement for motivation or mood. As far as the individual ingredients, there is some research that looked at combining caffeine with creatine. And in the first study, the subjects loaded with creatine for 6 days and 6 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine, and then consumed a higher dose of caffeine on testing day. And they found an enhancement in sprint performance over creatine alone. In another study, they consumed 3 milligrams per kilogram of creatine and then caffeine for 5 days prior to testing, and they found no synergism, no performance improvements for any condition above placebo. A difference between these studies might be attributed to the training status, as the subjects in the first study were well trained, but the subjects in the second study were only moderately trained. And we know that caffeine seems to exert a greater benefit in trained subjects versus untrained subjects. Second difference is the higher dose of caffeine prior to testing in that first study may also have impacted the results. Now, some studies show that caffeine blunts the ergogenic effects of creatine, and this may be due to diverging effects of the supplements on muscular relaxation times, but it's most likely due to GI discomfort when consuming the two alone. So there's a pretty good theory for synergism between caffeine and creatine, where they might actually improve performance. However, given that, at least in one study conducted by Dr. Antonio and colleagues, creatine taken post-workout had a greater impact on lean mass than creatine taken pre-workout, a better strategy might be to split up your caffeine and creatine, taking caffeine pre-workout and your creatine post-workout. And that's where we're at with pre-workout supplements. So we know that caffeine, citrulline, Malate are likely ergogenic when taken acutely, and creatine is ergogenic when taken chronically. Synergism, however, is defined as the interaction or cooperation of two or more organizations, substances, or other agents to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. To really understand whether these ingredients function in a synergistic fashion or not, we need future studies to compare the products against one or more of the proven major ingredients alone, rather than placebo. A good start would be to compare pre-workout supplements acutely against caffeine and a placebo, and chronically against creatine and a placebo. This study, comparing pre-workout supplements acutely against caffeine and a placebo, is currently in the works in conjunction with some of my colleagues at the University of Poznan in Poland, and it will be conducted as soon as the research facilities open back up and COVID is underway. So we as sports scientists need to start performing this research, and we need to start getting supplement companies on board. Until this research is conducted, it's really difficult to say whether pre-workout supplements confer some sort of benefit against using caffeine, creatine, and citrulline malate on their own. Until a body of synergism research is available, consumers might do best, both physiologically and economically, to purchase ingredients with strong evidence separately and consume them at appropriate times. And that concludes my presentation.
Thanks so much, Jason. We're going to go to the Q&A session here. So we've got some time for questions. We do have one currently in the chat from Joe Boone. Joe is one of our former graduate students at Kennesaw State. He asks, to your knowledge, are there any studies that have looked at taurine's impact on water and or salt regulation? Are there any studies that have compared caffeine? Let's start with the first part. Let's start with the first part. Yep. So to your knowledge, are there any studies that have looked at taurine's impact on water and or salt regulation?
No, not to my knowledge, but that also does not mean anything. There very well could be. I haven't really looked into that, so I can't speak to that.
Okay. His follow-up here, or second question, are there any studies that have compared caffeine to caffeine plus taurine to a placebo, or has it just been caffeine plus taurine to a placebo?
Most of the ones that I saw, so again, to my knowledge, were caffeine combined with taurine against the placebo. I haven't seen any, I've seen taurine against the placebo, but I haven't seen caffeine plus taurine against caffeine against taurine against the placebo. So that would be a great study to investigate synergism. Now, as far as the caffeine and taurine studies that I reviewed, it was in regards to cognitive performance, and taurine alone did not enhance cognitive performance in one study, and then in a separate study, caffeine plus taurine did enhance cognitive performance against the placebo. But again, that enhancement could have just been the caffeine. We don't know if if there was any synergism between caffeine and taurine.
Okay. Great. Another question. Is there a specific dose of caffeine according to the type of athlete or games that they would be engaging in to enhance performance? So what would you recommend for a caffeine dosage for an endurance athlete versus a resistance training athlete versus a team sport athlete?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at, I'm not aware of any studies, and I'm not aware of a position stand on that either. But the most effective doses of caffeine appear to be about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Anything less than that doesn't seem to confer much of an ergogenic benefit. And when you start getting above 6 milligrams per kilogram, you start running into some side effects. GI discomfort would probably be the most common one. So in that 3 to 6 milligram per kilogram range is going to be most effective. Now, as a practitioner, I would recommend starting low and doing some experimentation with your athletes and documenting some of the results, both objective in terms of performance and then subjective in terms of discomfort, anxiety, etc.
Great. Another question from Matthew Stratton. With betaine showing up more and more in multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements, can you speak on the possible efficacy of the acute effects on a resistance training